Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a Came from the Network. This one comes as a recommendation from my good friend Jamie from Bucky749, and it's one actually that's not on Peacock but on YouTube. I'll leave a link down here in the description for you to go watch this. You can watch it, come back and listen to the review, because if you watch this first there is going to be spoilers if you haven't seen it, and if you don't know by the thumbnail, we're going to be reviewing Smoky Mountain Wrestling Bluegrass Brawl 1993. Now, before I do get into the show, there are a couple things I want to cover up front. If you do watch this, it is a product of its time. There are Confederate flags in the crowd, on the wrestlers. And do I think that the wrestlers, specifically Tracy Smothers, wears one here and carries a Confederate flag? Do I think he was racist? No. Do I think it was a different time? Yes. It wasn't as out and prevalent that was something that was looked at so negatively. I mean, the Dukes of Hazzard had it on their car. The Godwins in WWE would wear Confederate flag shirts. The Freebirds even painted their faces as a Confederate flag. They might be a bad example for the Michael Hayes reason, but I don't think they meant it in a bad way, so keep that in mind if you're watching this, that it is 30 plus years ago and sensibilities have changed. I don't think that even Jim Cornette would let them wear that out at this point in his career. I digress. That being said, if you haven't seen my shows before, I do grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. Let's jump right into it. This show started off with our announcers for the show, which is going to be Les Thatcher and Lance Russell. Now, I'm going to cover this here in a moment because this show is very much an homage to the Knoxville area and the former Southeast Championship Wrestling that came from there. There's a lot of ties back to that and a lot of ties to the Memphis area. Obviously, both of those areas work together. There was a lot of deals between the two. So this show has a lot of that. Les Thatcher was the announcer for Southeast Championship Wrestling. Lance Russell, obviously, for CWA and USWA out of Memphis. That goes right into our first match, which is a legendary wrestler in both Memphis and Knoxville. Made a lot of his career in Knoxville and a lot of his career in Canada. That's a Mongolian Stomper, and he's going up against Rob Morgan here. This was a much older Mongolian Stomper. His heyday had been 20 years prior to this, and even at that time, I believe he was older. I want to say the Mongolian Stomper was in his 50s, may have even been in his 60s here. He still looked to be in great shape. He did wear his ring jacket the whole time. This is basically a glorified squash match, and I liken this to a show I just went to recently. I went to the MLW War Chamber show, and one of the selling points for me was getting to see Raven again, because I hadn't seen Raven wrestle live in a number of years, probably since his TNA days. So seeing one of my favorites, even though he's older, not as mobile, didn't do much in the match, I still cheered for him more than anybody else on that card. And I kind of feel like this was what Mongolian Stomper was to this crowd. If I'm being honest, I didn't like the match. Stomper obviously wins. I'm giving it a 2. Next up, we have Brian Lee. He's going to roll dice to see what his match coming up against Kevin Sullivan's going to be. It ends up on him where Brian Lee gets to pick the stipulation. He decides he wants to do a Singapore spike match, which is different than a Singapore cane match. Basically, it's a railroad spike that they get to use that's in one of 4 boxes. 3 boxes are going to be empty, one's going to have it in there. That sets up for later in the show. That's followed up with an interview with Tim Horner. And I've heard a lot of people say how bad Tim Horner is as a promo. And I wouldn't say he's great. I wouldn't say he's Dusty Rhodes or Ric Flair or Terry Funk or any of the greats of all time. But I wouldn't put him in the bottom percentile. I'd probably say he was about average. He's very much a product of his environment, much like I said about this. You got to remember, Smoky Mountain Wrestling is a territory that was built on Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, that little area, Tennessee, very much the Appalachian area of the country, which is a little bit different than most other places. There's a lot of very southern tinged, southern pride type stuff on this show. Like Charlie Daniels Band gets played for one of the wrestlers. It's what it is. I mean, it's for its audience. If this was made in New York, obviously there'd have a New York tinge. If it was made in Philadelphia, it'd be an ECW tinge. So Horner fits perfectly for this kind of a company, in my opinion. A very southern company, a very Southern wrestler. And that's not a bad thing. We go right into the match with Tim Horner. He's going up against the Night Stalker, aka Adam Bomb, aka Brian Clark of Chronic and Wrath later on. I actually thought this was a good match. I liked it a lot better than the first match. There was a good dichotomy of the bigger guy versus the smaller, faster guy, and the Night Stalker really showed some star potential here. I kind of wonder if he never had the Adam Bomb gimmick, would he have been someone that got as big as a Scott Hall or a Kevin Nash? Would have he been thought more positively? Because this wasn't a bad gimmick. It was very kind of hokey, kind of a little bit Undertaker-ish in a way, but I don't think it was bad. I think the Adam Bomb was a little cartoony, and I think that hurt him a lot. When he came back as Wrath, Wrath was absolutely amazing, even with that poor of a gimmick that they didn't seem to care about. He had a lot of fans in WCW. So I kind of wonder if his career took a different path. He was an Adam Bomb. He was allowed to be maybe the Night Stalker in WWE. Would he be looked at more positively? Horner picks up the win by disqualification when the Night Stalker throws him over the top rope, which, yes, it's still that era of wrestling. Famously, Smoky Mountain's tagline is wrestling the way that you remember and the way that you want it to be. Very old school. I thought this was a good match. I'm not a fan of that ending, but I'm going to give it a 3 because I thought it was good. Next up, we get an interview with Kevin Sullivan. He talks about his fight coming up against Brian Lee, compares it to clubbing a seal, which, okay, go ahead, Kevin, say what you're going to say. Kevin Sullivan said some of the craziest thing on commentary that's ever been said, between the Cosmic Cookie and all of the quote-unquote semi-satanic stuff in Florida, to this, to the stuff in the Dungeon of Doom. It's just off the wall. I love Kevin Sullivan, by the way. He's absolute favorite of mine. I watch Kevin Sullivan in Florida highlights all the time. They come up on my YouTube recommendations all the time, and even if I watched a clip 1,000 times, I'm still going to watch it because it's just that good of a presentation, in my opinion. I think it's one of the best presentations of a heel of all time, in my opinion. That leads us right into the match, which is going to be Kevin Sullivan versus Brian Lee. Brian Lee has Tim Horner in his corner. Sullivan has the Night Stalker. They're both handcuffed to opposite corners. We get boxes on top of each ring post, and one of them is going to have the spike in it. TNA has done similar things like this. A lot of different companies have. It's kind of an interesting gimmick because obviously they know where it is, but it kind of adds to that, and you know it's always going to be the last box they go for. I like this. This was a brutal brawl. This was more akin to what we would see in ECW that was already starting to bubble up at this time and really got big a year or two later. So we get to see some of that traditional Memphis brawling style here. This is probably my second favorite match on the card. I really enjoyed it. And again, it could be my bias for Kevin Sullivan. Ultimately, Brian Lee picks up the win, where it seems that the Night Stalker somewhat has turned against Sullivan by hiding the spike from him. I thought this was really good. Like I said, I rather enjoyed this. This was violent. It was fun. It was everything I enjoy about wrestling. I'm giving it a 4. Next up, we have an interview with Tracy Smothers. He's talking about his championship match where he's going to face a Dirty White Boy later on. That leads us right into an interview with the Dirty White Boy, Dutch Mantell, and Ron Wright, yet another Knoxville legend, yet another wrestler tied to this area. A guy that I don't think wrestled out of the territory much, and if he did, he may have only did certain spots in like Florida or Memphis every now and then, but mostly was in that territory. Ron Wright is the perfect example of a small territory guy that stayed in that territory and was a big star there. Kind of similar to, let's say, Carlos Colon, even though Carlos Colon is on a bigger scale, very similar to that. Basically, they're talking. Ron Wright is the Dirty White Boy's manager at this point, which kind of disappointed me because I wanted to see the Dirty White Girl. If you watched my videos long enough, you know I have an affinity for the Dirty White Girl. I think she's an extremely attractive woman, and I had a big crush on her as a kid, and I still do as a full-grown adult. But anyway, I digress. Basically, Ron Wright is saying he's kept his chain, which has been his chain that he's used all through his career. He's kept it till he found somebody worthy. He's going to give it to the Dirty White Boy, who is the one worthy. That leads us to another video. This was obviously ripped from the home video version of this, which is really cool that they did that, because I remember they used to sell this tape and you could buy it. I know I've seen it in magazines, and I don't remember where else. It probably if you got the Smoky Mountain TV show weekly, you probably could order it directly from there. That takes us right to Dirty White Boy, who's supposed to be in Central Park, because Dirty White Boy's from New York City, actually Tennessee he's from, and he's got a table and he's smashing things like beer bottles because Tracy Smothers is drunk, watermelons because his head looks like a watermelon, flour because he's a sack of flour. It's interesting. Dirty White Boy doesn't get a lot of credit. Again, another guy that got hampered by a bad gimmick in the WWE becoming TL Hopper. I think he's better than that. I like the Dirty White Boy. He's a good wrestler in my opinion. That brings us into the match, which is the Dirty White Boy defending the Smoky Mountain Championship against Tracy Smothers in a chain match. The purpose of this is one of those ones where they have to touch all four corners. Again, very much old school. And I like this. Again, another violent match, another bloody match. Another one where they kind of follow the tropes where they both tag all four corners and all that good stuff. I rather enjoyed this. I mean, these are two really good wrestlers. Tracy Smothers is a great wrestler. Dirty White Boy doesn't get the credit he deserves, doesn't get it remembered as much as he should. A lot like Tracy Smothers. Even more so because I think Tracy Smothers is more remembered than Dirty White Boy is, but they're both really good here. Ultimately, Smothers picks up the win when he's following Dirty White Boy and touching all the corners, and then kind of gets beeled over the Dirty White Boy, lands on his feet and touches the fourth corner, which was really cool. Although they did say an offensive move would stop the count, but they kind of ignored it. And I understand, it was interesting. I enjoyed it. This was something that I seen the Rock and Roll Express did this same kind of thing a lot back when they had chain matches against the Russians. So very much an old school thing. Like I said, Tracy Smothers wins the championship. I'm giving this one a 4. I thought it was really good. That's followed up with a backstage interview with Tracy Smothers. As he's being interviewed, the Dirty White Boy comes in and attacks him, which obviously we're going to keep that feud going, which is awesome because I thought they had a really good match and I'd really like to see more, especially if I was in this time frame. I would have wanted to see them continue to have more battles because they were awesome together. That leads us into the promos that will lead us into the main event of the show. First up, we get the Stud Stable, which is Rob Fuller, which would go on to be Colonel Parker, Jimmy Golden, who would go on to be Bunkhouse Buck. That's where you probably remember him most. In Knoxville, they're legends. Again, they tie back to that old Southeastern Championship Wrestling territory that was run by Rob's brother and Jimmy Golden's cousin, Ron Fuller. They're teaming up with Dirty Dutch Mantell. Again, if you've seen my videos where I cover Memphis wrestling, Dutch is one of my favorites of the Memphis wrestlers. I love Dutch Mantell. Love his podcast too. You should check that out. It's a very good podcast. He's very entertaining. They do their promo. Then our second team, it's going to be a 3-team match, a 3-team of 3 match. We get Arn Anderson and the Rock and Roll Express, which is a team that I don't think anybody ever put on their bingo card, just for all the wars that the Horsemen and the Rock and Rolls had back in the day. Another good match. Arn does the majority of the talking because you better let Arn talk when it's these 3 guys, because as much as I like the Rock and Roll Express, they never were great promos, but Arn is definitely. That's followed up with our third and final team, the Heavenly Body Express. You got the Heavenly Bodies, Dr. Tom Pritchard and Sweet Stan Lane, and then also the Midnight Express, Sweet Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton. So it's the Heavenly Body Express, I guess? I don't know. With Jim Cornette, obviously, because he managed both teams. Of course, this is great. Corny does most of the talking here, again, because much like Arn Anderson, if you got Jim Cornette, you let Jim Cornette talk. That leads us into our main event, a 3-way battle, which is interesting because if you hear Cornette on his podcast, he talks often about how he doesn't like 3-way matches, but yet here's one of the first big 3-way matches in America. At least one of the first ones I remember. There's probably others before this, but this is one of the first ones that I really remember. We get the Stud Stable, Ron Fuller, Jimmy Golden, Dutch Mantell, the Rock and Roll team, Robert Gibson, Ricky Morton, Arn Anderson, going up against the Cornette team, which is Stan Lane, Tom Pritchard, and Bobby Eaton. And this is, much like I said, everything that Jim Cornette says he doesn't like. It's a brawl, it's a 3-way, it's a street fight, and I kind of get where he gets when he's talking about these matches that are just out of nowhere, where no one has a feud. At the time, this was interesting because all 3 teams were kind of feuding with each other, and this was a way to give something new and something innovative. idea. ECW would do it, I think not even a year later, when they have Shane Douglas versus Sabu versus Terry Funk, a very similar thing where the three of them were feuding. This was by far my favorite match of the show. It was a wild brawl. I mean, you have some of the best wrestlers of the time. Obviously we have the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express. They're all great. Arn Anderson, fantastic. Tom Pritchard, highly underrated. Heavenly Body are underrated, whether it be him and Stan or him and Gigolo Jimmy Del Rey. The Stud Stable, not a team that a lot of people really remember. Like I said, much like Ron Wright, they were mostly in that territory. They did some stuff in the USWA. You're going to remember them more for their time as Colonel Parker and Bunkhouse Buck. Dutch Mantel, I think, is a legend, but probably not to a lot of other people. I thought this was a really fun match. Ultimately, Team Cornette picks up the win here. I really, really enjoyed this. This was, like I said, by far my favorite match of the card. I'm giving this one a 5. Overall, I enjoyed this show. I think it holds up really well, even though it was old school by the time, and there's a lot of old school stipulations here. I still think this holds up better than some of the WCW, some of the WWE stuff of the same era. There's something to be said about simplistic storytelling, wild brawls, Southern style, Memphis style wrestling, all tied up into this. Overall, I'm going to give this show a 4. I thought it was highly enjoyable. If you're a fan of some of the Southern style wrestling, whether it be Smoky Mountain or Jim Crockett Promotions or Georgia Championship Wrestling or anything of that nature, you would definitely like this, especially if you haven't seen it before. It's kind of a nice little time capsule of a really cool, basically the last territory being Smoky Mountain. Well, Memphis lasted a couple more years, but one of the last few territories, and this was a territory that was created in the dying days of the territories, but very much territory style wrestling. Like I said, I'm going to give the whole show a 4. I thought it was very enjoyable. If you do want to check it out, it is going to be down here in the description. While you're there, smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. And if you made it here to the end, much like Kendrick Lamar and Drake have a feud that's pretty much the talk of the world right now. The Midnights and Rock and Rolls had a feud that went on for decades, and probably you can still find remnants of it today. Let me know what side you were on. Were you on the Midnight Express side, the Rock and Roll Express side? Pick a side, put it down here in the comments. Or if you want to pick a side between Drake and Kendrick, put that down there in the comments too. I'm Team Kendrick. I don't hate you if you're Team Drake. I prefer Kendrick's music. I think Drake has some good music too. I have both of them on my Spotify playlists. But if I'm going to pick one over the other, I'm Team Kendrick. Kendrick is more my style of rapper. Kendrick, Nas, that kind of rapper. J. Cole even in there. But anyway, I digress. I'm not going to go into that because I could talk for an hour about the different diss tracks that they made against each other. But anyway, Team Rock and Roll, Team Midnight, Team Drake, Team Kendrick, let me know down in the comments. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another It Came From the Network.